My name is Afifa Abdurrahman, and I'm a gender advisor working in the Office of Population and Reproductive Health at USAID, the Global Health Bureau. And I'm pleased to be with you today to act as a moderator for what I think will be a very fascinating conversation. I want to get logistics out of the way very quickly. One, if you need to use the restrooms, please use first, the keys are on the back table. And we ask that you use the back door to exit to go to the restroom, and then follow the signs that will take you to the male and female restrooms. Also, if you haven't had any breakfast or partaken of some of the goodies over here on the left, please feel free to do so at any point in time, of course quietly as people are presenting, but we encourage you to take as much as you want and as much coffee as you need. So, before I dive into introducing our event, I'd like to welcome Michael McCabe, who's the USAID's new agency youth coordinator. And if you could stand up, say hi. We're really excited that Michael is here because we've been waiting and waiting for him to arrive. So we're really happy to meet you. Some of us are meeting you for the first time. So welcome.
Thank you.
So welcome to part 3 of the Interagency Gender Working Group's series of events on exploring the issues of gender-based violence in youth. The purpose of this series is to provide a space for dialogue among individuals working in child and women's rights, gender-based violence, and reproductive health to explore gender-based violence in the context of the life course and developmental stages of adolescence. The series aims to highlight promising interventions that shed light on addressing manifestations of GBV at a specific life stage, featuring interventions and innovations on positive parenting, primary school-based gender norms, and dating violence. So the first event in this series set the stage with a conversation on the prevalence of childhood violence and its impact on reproductive health. The second event shed light on the impact of implementation of a dating violence curriculum among high school students in Haiti. And these two events happened earlier in the year. There's information on the IGWG website for these presentations. So if you want to know more, we can provide you with that link at the end of our meeting today. So today, for part 3, we'll dive into an exploration of gender norms and parenting skills that help to shape adolescents' experience with violence throughout the life course. And first we'll have Mark Tomlinson, who will set the stage and highlight the connection between early childhood experiences of violence as a risk factor for later victimization and perpetration, and where parenting programs fit in that equation. Mark will also share a first look at an evidence-based cutting-edge parenting project in South Africa that we're really excited to hear from him about. And then we're going to hear from Kim Ashburn, who will share a close look at the approach, evaluation, and lessons learned from a well-known program in Uganda that engages men as fathers in violence prevention. So we're going to follow each of these presentations with a 20-minute discussion session. So participants will have an opportunity to shower the speakers with all sorts of challenging questions and to make them sweat. So please prepare lots of good questions. So first, I would like to introduce Mark Tomlinson, who's joining us virtually from South Africa. Mark Tomlinson is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. His work has spanned a diverse range of topics, but with a focus on factors that contribute to compromised maternal health, to understanding infant and child development in contexts of high adversity, and to developing community-based intervention programs. Professor Tomlinson is particularly interested in understanding infant and child development in the context of caregiver mental illness. He has conducted 5 large randomized controlled trials aimed at improving maternal and child health and infant development, and is currently implementing 3 other trials, including one in Lesotho. He is an associate editor of the Infant Mental Health Journal and is also on the editorial boards of several journals, including the Public Library of Science Medicine, Psychology, Health and Medicine, and Mental Health and Prevention. He has published over 160 papers in peer-reviewed journals. He's edited 2 books and published numerous chapters. Professor Tomlinson, welcome.
Wait. Can you hear himself? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. Everybody, I was diligently on mute there, so thanks for the invitation. I've only ever done this a couple of times, presenting virtually, so it's a little odd speaking to a computer, but I'm gonna do my best. So. First up, I hate starting with sort of apologies, but I'm going to start with that anyway. So first up, I'm not an expert on gender, so I want to put that on the table right at the beginning. And secondly, the second part of my presentation, I'm going to be presenting for Tamarin Crankshaw, who couldn't do it. It would have been really great to have her. I was involved in the project I'm going to talk about, but she's primarily she's the PI of the project, so it's thanks to her. So. Just first up, I'm based at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, which is just outside of Cape Town. It's where all the good wine comes from. And we have a research group which is called Prevention Research for Community, Family and Child Health. We have a website right at the moment. It's currently being redesigned, so if you were to log on, you would see the old version, but in the next couple of weeks, hopefully we've got a new snazzy version up. I'm a public health person. I'm very involved in public health. I like public health. I try and think about things at a population level. And given the shift from MDGs to SDGs, I try to locate a lot of our work within a number of things, obviously within the SDGs, but for me, very importantly in this, the global strategy for women, children's and adolescents' health, which is a UN document, and I think it's an essential document. It's going to be the template within which a lot of donor money is going to be thought about and dispersed. Now, part of what I'm interested in infant and child development really speaks to that second pillar. So there are 3 pillars within this. The survive, everyone knows about that. But what shifted in this global strategy is the addition of the pillars of thrive and transform. I'm very interested in thrive and what that means, and what that means really across the life course of infants, children, adolescents, and then ultimately adults. So I'm going to talk in terms of, as an introduction, the kind of introduction. I've done a lot of work in early infancy and early child development, and I'm very interested in how violence develops, how early it starts. And as we know, most violence is perpetrated by adolescents and young adult males. Whether that's interpersonal violence, whether that's violence against strangers. But in fact, that often starts out in an abnormal pattern of pervasive and persistent aggression. And one of the very interesting kind of things we often don't think about is I often ask people, when do you imagine that people are the most aggressive? And often, were I in front of you now, I would give you some time to think about that. And usually people would often throw out things like 15, 16, or 19. In fact, the most aggressive people on earth really are 2 to 3-year-olds. Anybody who's had a 2 or 3-year-old will know how they kick, punch, pull hair, bite. They don't do much damage because they're little. They're 2 to 3-year-olds. But in fact, if you just count the aggressive acts, they're pretty aggressive. And from a developmental perspective, we would argue that to some extent, and obviously this is not the whole picture and it's much more complex, but that in fact children learn not to be aggressive rather than only somehow learn it through peer group interaction or violence in the environment. And so in that early aggression, if you see it in that, about half of boys and girls, which is interesting, it's not just about boys, the decline that happens naturally through socialization doesn't happen. And that in many cases it actually becomes entrenched. And that's for a whole number of reasons, which I don't have time to go into, such as harsh and punitive parenting, witnessing violence in the home, community violence, and any number of factors. And this early developmental pattern, when this early aggression becomes entrenched, is a strong predictor of youth violence, violence offending, and particularly violence against women and girls. And obviously that violence, as I've said, is predicted by a range of factors, but parenting is a key one. And that's something that I'm very interested in thinking about and trying to prevent and to sort of target that as a key risk mechanism. The main parenting kind of features, characteristics that are implicated in this are, for example, harsh and coercive parenting, lack of parental reinforcement, lack of responsiveness, often corporal punishment, particularly very high levels of that, and as well as factors such as monitoring of young children. So a number of factors. I don't have much time, so I'm going to talk very briefly about a couple of pieces of work we've done, and I'm happy to share papers with anybody who's interested, and you can email me or I can share them with Lee. But we would argue, and where we come from is that from the perspective of this early trajectory is that interventions are going to be very effective if you begin with young children. And so that they should ideally be implemented in high-risk conditions, ideally in infancy, preferably beginning even earlier, preferably beginning in the first 1,000 days at conception. And one could even make an argument, and that's increasingly being made, that one should in fact start pre-conception. And we would argue that it's that point that perhaps parents can be more easily helped to influence their child's behavior. And maybe just a brief statement to say is that parenting is very often misunderstood as somehow experts on parenting, which I don't think there are. Anyone who's had a child, I have two, knows that you're not an expert. You flounder around crazily and you hope that you just don't do them too much harm. Is that it's not about us telling people what's best. It's about trying to facilitate a different way of conceptualizing children. So that a lot of the things that we will do are really about not telling a parent, for example, of a one-week-old that they can hear you, but rather showing them in a very clever way is how they'll turn preferentially, for example, to the sound of their mother's voice or their father's voice rather than that of a stranger. So it's as little didactic as we can possibly make it, and it's not about us somehow thinking that we're the expert in telling people what to do. I'm very involved in home visiting. Almost all the trials that I've done involve community health workers in one way or another visiting people in their homes. And in most of parts of Africa, South Asia, this is where a lot of parenting programs are going to happen. For us, in some ways, the gold standard of home visiting is David Olds' nurse-family partnership that he conducted in 3 sites in the US. And he's shown significant reductions in child maltreatment, aggression in children, in girls under 18, and a large swathe of reduction in risk factors later. We also know that there's been work in Jamaica that has shown that young children will engage in fewer fights, less serious violence 20 to 25 years later after an early intervention. And there's been some evidence of how these cognitive stimulation interventions can protect against bullying. I want to just touch on two trials we've done, and as I said, I can send these results. One was one in which we, doing home visiting, really focused on improving the mother-infant-child relationship, and we found that we were able to, on a number of outcomes, including child attachment, infant attachment, maternal sensitivity and responsiveness, as well as in certain subgroups even improve child cognitive development at 18 months. So this is again home visiting with community health workers, about 16 visits across pregnancy and the first 6 months of life. And we've now recently just finished following up that sample of infants at the age of 13 with money from Grand Challenges Canada, and the first paper, in fact, on cortisol and poverty has just been accepted for publication, and a number are following. We've also doing increasing work, and this is also work that this trial the slide you see is not about the Lesotho work that was briefly mentioned, but currently with USAID funding, we're implementing a large cluster randomized controlled trial, an integrated program where we're looking at HIV, nutrition, maternal and child health, as well as early cognitive stimulation using this intervention on dialogic book sharing. And this can be used from about, believe it or not, the age of 6 months on. It's not about the reading, it's not about literacy, it's really about using book sharing as a way of facilitating a different kind of relationship between mothers and infants in our case, but obviously could be any caregiver. And we've shown it to have very important outcomes, very, very powerful outcomes on infant attention, on maternal sensitivity, and even, and this is something we're exploring in a new trial that we're doing here in Cape Town, on important components of theory of mind, and we would argue the early development of empathy and helping of others. And what we're hoping to do is to follow these trials up later to show that hopefully by this, impacting on factors such as potential theory of mind and early empathy, that will reduce later child externalizing behavior and hopefully later aggression. So the question is, what does this mean? Where I'm running out of time, if I move on to the second presentation. It's a kind of a cautionary note. I think as researchers, we love having a trial that shows something and then thinking we have the answer. One of my mentors, Arnold Samaroff, who some of you may know, sort of a doyen of early childhood program in the US, he recently, a couple of years ago, stood up at a conference and said, I've now retired, and the one thing I've learned is that, in all my years, is that I've never ever been wrong. And the audience laughed, and he said, so, as people came to him over the course of his career with a trial result or a new PhD or something, and he said, they always say to him, just got this incredible result, I now know the answer. This is the answer for it. And he'd always say to them, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. And he said, after 40, 50 years, I've never ever been wrong. And so the idea that you can go in and intervene early and affect, for example, an entire life course of violence, I suspect is much more complicated than that. Two examples of that are a study by Jonah Masalko and colleagues, which followed up a very successful trial on perinatal depression in Pakistan, and they reduced antenatal depression by 50%. So it was a massive effect. They assumed, obviously, that in that follow-up, there'd be impacts on child cognitive, child social, emotional development, and in fact, it wasn't the case at all. And in fact, part of the effect went in the wrong direction. Equally, the gold standard, David Older's program, was taken to the UK, and in a paper published last year was shown to not work in the UK. So it's complicated. Equally, in terms of thinking about gender, is that for the most part, and I think the program in Uganda that you're going to hear about later is a fantastic example of where this is being done, where fathers are being included, is that the gender component isn't there, that it's we tend to work with mothers that are there. The fathers often are absent, and it's not in our own making, but that we're often not directly thinking about and targeting the gender component and thinking about how gender roles are being very early on are being reinforced, and I think that's a real limitation and something that needs to be thought about. So they're really designed around mothers. Equally, there are big structural issues that we have to consider here. I'm skeptical about the extent to which, for example, in many of the places I work in South Africa, the kind of issues around patriarchy are deep and embedded, and I'm not convinced that a parenting program on its own is going to significantly impact on that. I think the parenting programs are essential, and they need to think more about how they can shift gender norms and how we think about the kinds of messages we give, the kinds of information we provide. But equally, if we really want to see impact, they're going to have to happen in tandem, I would argue, with much larger structural shifts and structural issues. And at the recent AIDS conference in Durban, one of the presentations I went to was speaking about that very much in terms of HIV, that in many ways so much progress has been made, and that in fact the future progress is going to actually depend not on ARTs and not on medical solutions, but on those together with these structural changes. I'm not going to show that slide right now because I really want to get on to the next presentation. So I don't know if you want me to stop now for questions or go straight into the next presentation.
I would go next into the next presentation.
Sure. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about here is a program called Sikhula 1 Year, which means growing together in isiZulu, and it's a program. It's it's less about, it wasn't a research study in terms of testing the impact of this intervention, but rather it was funded by the Sexual Violence Research Initiative of the Medical Research Council in South Africa. And what it was to develop an innovative group-based parenting program using media that could potentially be implemented ideally at scale. And the next step, which hasn't happened as yet, will be to actually implement that. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the program itself. As I said at the beginning, the main person involved is Tamarin Crankshaw, and in fact Lisa Butler from Harvard. And there are a number of people involved in the study, and there are a number of and the main funder being the SVRI. So some of this I've touched on. It's really about this early intervention in trying to reduce harsh parenting and child maltreatment, because that early harsh parenting and child maltreatment can have impacts right across the lifespan. So what we were trying to do in this study was to design, manualize a proof of concept intervention for effective parenting. And the idea was that it would be delivered in group settings. It was developed in KwaZulu-Natal, in the main center there, which is Durban, and so not in a home-based setting in this situation, but potentially to be used even in a clinic setting or some other appropriate community setting, but using groups in order to possibly improve its scalability. So we had a number of objectives to obviously to develop this intervention, to then pilot test this curricula and media to assess acceptability and understandability, and then produce these final intervention materials. This is a busy slide. I'm not going to stay on it too long. Really, what we were trying to, with the two core components we were wanting to focus on was harsh parenting, to reduce that and improve responsive parenting. And the argument is that by, for example, focusing on responsive parenting, that it's not just about, I mean, often people think about responsive parenting as a kind of a, teaching or facilitating, however you want to word it, parents to be nicer, to, and of course that's part of it if you're trying to reduce harsh parenting. But we would argue that by improving responsiveness, there's a number of things that sort of move out from that. So for example, if a caregiver can improve the responsivity, that has implications for a number of things. We've shown how, in fact, it can increase illness detection. So, for example, in early neonatal period, where babies, particularly in adverse situations, are very, very vulnerable, for example, to pneumonia. The early signs of pneumonia are subtle. They're not, unless you're medically trained, very easily picked up. But if you can increase responsivity, and it's not about necessarily teaching what the signs and symptoms of early pneumonia are, but the extent to which one can be more responsive, the more likely you are to pick up those subtle changes in breathing, which you might otherwise have thought was a simple cold, but in fact could develop into something much more serious. And equally, in many of the settings within which we work, monitoring of children in terms of their safety, and that's safety both within the home and outside the home. In Cape Town, we have an ongoing problem of very severe burns with children where people without access to electricity use paraffin stoves, and young babies pull the burning paraffin onto themselves. And often in Cape Town, for example, we have in summer very, very high winds which blow sort of these paraffin lamps over sometimes, and people will use them for cooking as well. And so we would also argue that responsivity leads to improved child monitoring, which leads to improved child safety and a whole number of benefits, and not simply a kind of a sensitivity to one's child. And in our book sharing work, one of the things we're really focusing on is on what we would call, what in the developmental literature is joint attention. That capacity for a parent to share in that experience with the child. The child points to something, the young child, the parent speaks to them and attends to where they're pointing, shares the experience with them, and that elaboration then of what they see is very important in terms of later cognitive outcomes, for example. So the core of it, there were two main areas we used in that. The one is something called Care for Child Development, which is an intervention that has been developed by the World Health Organization and UNICEF. And it's for use. It's freely available. You can download it from WHO and UNICEF websites. And it's really an ECD intervention for use in low and middle income countries. And then also in developing this intervention, we used the project that I briefly spoke about, this what we call the Tulasana intervention, which improved infant attachment and later infant cognitive development, was based on 2 books that have been written by Lynn Murray, who's one of our collaborators, called The Social Baby and then The Psychology of Babies. And it's really about this early sensitivity in this first year of life. And we used components, for example, of Barry Brazelton's neonatal behavioral assessment scale. So one of the things, for example, we will do, I touched on it earlier, was trying to improve parental understanding of the capacities of their babies. So in the Brazelton neonatal scale, what you will do is you'll hold an infant, and this can be a 3-day-old baby, a very, 1-day-old baby, in fact, face down on your arm, and you'll get the mother or caregiver to stand one side and a stranger the other, and you'll ask them to talk to the infant. And most infants, if they're alert and not sleeping or struggling with something, will turn, in fact, preferentially to the sound of the mother's voice. And when one shows that in kind of in situ, as it were, it's actually quite transformative. For many people, a 3-day-old is kind of seen in a way as a baby that you feed, you clothe, you keep dry. But the fact that they can turn preferentially, or in some cases even hear, is quite startling. And we've had people ululate like just charging out of the house in celebration of the fact that their 3-day-old can hear, and calling friends in. And we develop very clever things with the intervener. So if the baby is not turning, we can get them to turn very cleverly with our hands without anybody knowing, because we want to get the message across. It's about the sensitizing of the parent to the capacities and of their infants, and so we use this as the basis in developing this intervention. Again, we didn't want to be seen to be, again, the experts coming in and saying thinking we knew it. We ran a large number of semi-structured interviews to think about the parental conceptualizations of infants, of their children. Parenting was about. We ran them in both peri-urban as well as a more urban setting, and really to try and understand their beliefs, their understanding, support networks. And I think this is a real area which does need more work. So again, a paper I can send you that wasn't for this study, but we conducted some work in Kailicha with Carol Worthman from Emory, and she went in and we with our data collectors interviewed a number of mothers about how they understood child development, and really 2 things stood out. Is that we ended up with a hierarchy of what people understood to be the most important things to do for infants in this case, and love, sensitivity were there, but in the early infancy, those in fact came quite low. That the things high up on the hierarchy were things like keeping them safe, keeping them fed, keeping them warm, the kind of more functional, instrumental parts of parenting. Whereas, interesting that the things that we design as the experts, as the researchers, the things we design our interventions around early childhood development are often about sensitivity, responsiveness, those sorts of things, which in fact, for many of the women in that early period came much lower. And the second interesting thing from that work was that when asked about what's the most important, when do you as a parent have the most important impact or most impact on your child's life, and almost to the last person that was involved, they said 13 years old, which I think is very interesting, because in my mind that's kind of often when parenting influence starts waning. If you haven't done your work by then, you kind of lose to the peer group. I think we didn't explore it in a lot. I think many of the women, I think, were saying not so much that that's where they have the most, but that's where they're the most afraid of the peer group and gangs and things. But I think there's a bit of a gap often in how we design, how we think interventions and when they should be delivered, and where the people we're designing them for, where they think they should be. So I think this kind of formative work and trying to understand conceptualizations of children and infants are absolutely essential. So in designing this media intervention, we went through a number of stages. So we went through a design stage with a media company called Jive Media. We developed a draft curriculum with storyboards. Then we got experts to review what the storyboards with some of the, and then the focus group discussions to see whether this was appropriate, whether it was understood. We then developed more storyboards and eventually some prototypes. And then we went into the field and showed the final product again to individuals as well as people in focus groups to get a sense of whether this was appropriate, whether it was understood, whether it spoke to the kinds of issues that parents in this environment were struggling with and what they found to be important. And then we ended up with this final curriculum and videos. And so the storyboards and the final product. Now I sent a link to Lee and others with an example of this video. I can maybe try and show it here. I don't know whether it's gonna come out. I can quickly go and link in perhaps, but we may be out of time. But you have got the link, and these are freely available for anybody. So there's no issues of ownership here or anything. And it's a mixture of cartoons as well as of actual infants and mothers and innovations and things that were happening with actual actors, if you will. And so it's a nice mixture of cartoon and the videos. The videos were filmed by a group of us who spent an entire day trying to cajole 5-day-old infants to mimic a smile and an open mouth and a variety of things, and I think we did a really good job. But we worked really hard with a lot of infants. We even had a pair of twins who were absolutely identical, and we dressed them in exactly the same clothing so that you didn't know whether the fact that the one was sleeping and wasn't interested but then woke up later, and so it'll appear as if it's one child, but in fact it was two. Because babies, we know that they, for example, do mimic and will even, I think Andrew Meltzoff, who was the first person to show infant imitation, was able to show that at even 27 minutes old, an infant is able to mimic a tongue protrusion or an open mouth, which is, I think, quite remarkable. But they tend not to always be that cooperative at 27 minutes or even 4 days. Or if you've got to do something like cajoling. But we've got a whole series of videos and these final products, which I've sent one, and we're quite happy to send others for people to look at. And so ultimately we've got an intervention of 5 sessions, each of 3 hours duration. Each session's then divided into 3 modules. They can be delivered in an individual setting, but obviously in terms of cost, I think ideally it would be in a group setting. And I think that while home visiting is essential and we keep doing it and we will continue to do it, we do need a mix of group and individual where possible. First 2 sessions ideally happen antenatally with 3 sessions in the early postnatal period. And again, they're designed as oral or practical events. They don't require literacy or an understanding of text. The learning approach is very much one of participation, problem-solving focused approach, and trying, particularly in the group settings, for parents to link with other parents with the same issues, same difficulties, be experiencing the same intervention, then hopefully that becomes a later support network once the intervention's not there. Okay. Just to give you an idea of some of the titles of the modules. Number 1, for example, just trying to access thoughts about what it feels like about having a baby, because we know that in many cases infants are unplanned, sometimes unwanted as well, and they evoke obviously very powerful feelings. And so we try to touch on some of that, as well as the planning for the new baby. So obviously that would be in the antenatal period. And then each session builds on the next. And again, I'm quite happy to share more details of this. and then we move into safety, for example, home community relationship mapping, and we have little components that are taken, for example, from the Tulasana intervention as well as from the Booksharing. This is not the full Booksharing intervention that we've developed, but just a component, trying to just to show parents what happens in a kind of a Booksharing intervention, even with very young infants. It's quite remarkable, and so we try to give a taste of that. So I'd just like to thank Liz Dartnell and the team from SVRI for the money, and all the other people who've been involved in both the Tulasana, the Booksharing, and obviously to Tamarin and Lisa Butler and Andy Gibbs for this presentation that I was really giving on their behalf. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Professor Tomlinson, for that very compelling, both of those presentations. Let's give him another round of applause. Wow. Okay, so a couple of things. We have about 20 minutes for, approximately 20 minutes for questions. And before we jump in, a few things. So before you provide your question, let us know who you are and where you work. And also for those of you who are joining us virtually, please input your question in the chat box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We have colleagues here standing by to pull these questions and share them with us. But we're going to start first with people in the room. So, yes.
Hi, Jill Gay, What Works Association. Dr. Tomlinson, thank you so much. My question is about preconception care. We learned in Durban, and there was the fabulous lunch session of What Works on violence prevention with Andy and Stepping Stones and everyone else. With the HIV, we also want preconception care so people can know how to safely conceive if one of the partners is positive or if both of the partners are positive. Yet globally we don't really have preconception care, and you've noted it as a key intervention. Would you sort of discuss the need for that structural need within services and how we can move that issue forward?
Right. Should I answer each one, or should I just go?
Yes.
I mean, I think, I mean, if the need for preconception care, if you just take it out of it's not just about the violence and aggression, but if you just think about preconception care, is I think we increasingly understanding not only how antenatal care or what happens in the postnatal period is instrumental in many things, but we're even beginning to understand the impact across generations. So so there's this notion of, you know, the developmental origins of health and disease, time scales of human adaptation, which there's some very interesting data coming out showing how, in fact, in some ways, the nutritional status of an infant is more related to the nutritional status of the grandmother than the mother. So these things are being carried across generations, and in fact you need generations to, in a way, I don't know how to describe, not the best word, but almost wash out some of these difficulties. Now, obviously, I'm not for a minute saying that nutrition during pregnancy doesn't have an impact on the child, but in fact there's a big component way back there. So, and we know that the nutritional status of adolescent girls, for example, and young women before they become pregnant is also implicated in the nutritional status of the infants before they become pregnant. So this preconception care, I think, is absolutely, we're gonna have to put this into the mix in the next few years, and we have to think about how to do it. And I think it's a very good opportunity, because often what happens, particularly, for example, around gender transformation, around violence, is that very often when there's a pregnant woman or a baby, that the focus very much becomes on that, and rightly so. And so it's very easy because of time, because of cost, to drop components that are to do with other things away. Whereas if you think about preconception care, I would argue, and I don't have data for this, and it's not something we've really focused on, but I would suggest that some of these components, such as gender and such as family planning, are much more easily dealt with there when you're, in a way, not being distracted by the baby. And I hope I'm not being too simplistic there. And we're also aware, I mean, increasingly, I think, in terms of the slide I didn't show, which really speaks to the life cycle, is that I would suggest that often what we need to be thinking about is how interventions are, in a way, are effective in a cumulative way. You know, so for example, the Jamaica study I mentioned had very important impacts on child cognitive development and child nutrition. And they've shown in a paper published in Science that had impact on wages 25 years later. That's very powerful. What we don't know, however, is that the issue in Jamaica, for example, is that when you do an early intervention, 94% of children in Jamaica go to preschool. It may not always be very good preschool, but they do go. I suggest that probably one of the factors is that you have that early intervention, which then gets built upon by the preschool, which then gets built upon the fact that there's a very high number of girls, for example, in primary school, and there's your impact. It's not just that little early intervention. Whereas in Ethiopia, where 18% of children are in preschool, simply doing an intervention early on may not actually have the long-term benefits that we would imagine, because they're not being reinforced and built upon with later, even if it's but just a structural grade R preschool or good primary school. So the more we understand about this cumulative benefit, one of the things we're going to look at obviously is going to be preconception care and how doing things there can then be built upon in pregnancy and then built upon. And at the moment, I know that WHO is going to be coordinating a large study in India, which is going to try and test exactly this. And it's about a 4-arm randomized control trial, very large, and literally going to look at the cumulative benefits of preconception, conception, postnatal in one arm, the next arm not have the preconception, to try and understand these dynamics. So yeah, I think it's essential. And I think my intuition says that we're going to see a lot more work on that in the years to come. I hope that answers the question.
It does. Thank you very much. The next question, please. Yes. Don't forget to say who you are, where you're from.
Jeff Jordan with Population Reference Bureau. This is fascinating, and thinking about intervention points at that early are somewhat difficult, because again, most of the time when we think about childhood interventions, we wait till they're in a school setting or a preschool setting or other kinds of things. So, I like this in the nursing care and some of the rest of it. Has there been much research also done on overlaps, as you mentioned, the first 1,000 days, and for breastfeeding or for other kinds of things where you combine nutrition aspects with a intimate relation aspect and other kinds of things? So, I mean, is there any of that in the research field going on right now that looks at those overlays or looks at that as an intervention point?
Sure. So, let me try to stab at that answer. So I mentioned in the talk that we got some funds from Grand Challenges Canada under a grant mechanism of theirs called Saving Brains. And Saving Brains 1 was what was called a re-enrollment grant. And what they did is that this longitudinal understanding of the impacts of early intervention, you've got David Olds, you've got some people in Australia, a few studies in Europe, but they're very limited in low and middle income countries. And I think I found out recently that the idea for this re-enrollment grant came from Cesar Victoria to Peter Singer at Grand Challenges. And what I think they did very cleverly is they funded 11 teams, Colombia, 2 in South Africa, 1 in Uganda, a number in South Asia. And they were all studies that had a randomized control trial intervention in the first 1,000 days, and then the funding had ended and the study stopped. Ours stopped at 18 months. And they provided funding to now go and find that cohort. And in some cases it was a long way. The original kangaroo mother care from Colombia, they were one of the studies, and they followed up those infants, those premature low birth weight infants who got kangaroo care in Colombia. They were now 25 years old. Wow. And they followed that sample up. Ours were 13. And And so those 11 studies are all going to be, some have been published, and I can again send you some of those if you'd like, to show various things. So the Joanna Masalka paper I spoke about in my presentation, that was one of them. Ours is another. Tamsin Rashar and Ruth Bland in a study from KwaZulu-Natal have, in a study, the original exclusive breastfeeding trial that showed the importance of exclusive breastfeeding in reducing mother-to-child transmission. They followed those children up, but I think it was between 7 or 9 years old, and they showed an effect, and that was published in PLOS Medicine in about a month ago, their paper. They showed an impact of exclusive breastfeeding on child conduct disorder at age 9. So there's some very interesting, we showed in a mother-infant injury, we haven't published this paper, we're busy writing it up, an impact on maternal mental state at age 13, 11 years after the intervention, that wasn't even targeted at maternal depression, for example. And there are going to be a number of studies that are going to be published in the next while from that study, and some of them are combined nutrition, psychosocial, some are purely nutritional, some are just a supplement, work in Indonesia, and so I can put you in touch and send you the website address as well. And so that would be a whole swathe of studies that are going to be coming out in the next year, which I think will go some way into answering that question.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I'm Mike McCabe from USA. Thank you very much for the great presentation. I guess my question is, what did we discover from those 2 interventions about the role of fathers in it, and how were they engaged in different ways, and thinking about the gender aspects of involvement in some of the various aspects there?
Right. I don't want to be flippant, so I'm going to choose my words carefully. Mostly what we've learned is that certainly in the studies in South Africa is that men, for the most part, aren't around. And it's as simple as that. So in some of our studies, 70% of the women in the study are single. So huge numbers, and being single doesn't mean that the father's not wanting to be involved, but it's very complicated. So in South Africa, we have in many communities we have a lobola system, which means when a woman is pregnant, the father has to, in a sense, it's a terrible way of saying it, pay damages to the mother's family, and with our high levels of unemployment, men in many cases are not able to do that. And if you aren't able to pay the damages if you're marry a child out of wedlock, if you aren't able to pay those damages, then the family very often refuses you any access to your child. So even when the desire of the father might be there, it's very difficult to get that access. And many of these are quite deeply embedded cultural belief systems, and that's, I suppose, what I was trying to touch on in what I was saying around the structural, that we need, in fact, I just sent an email this morning to someone called Lucas Radebe, who's a South African, he captained the South African football team, and he's a real icon for lots of people. He played in the English Premier League for many years, and he's also become an icon because his wife died tragically quite early, and he's become this man who goes around with his children when they were little in his arms and wherever he goes. And he's become an icon of trying to shift this notion of, that parenting is women's work and that men shouldn't be involved. And so I'm trying to engage him with another study we're doing using soccer as a way of engaging with high-risk men. Interestingly, in Lesotho in our study, this USAID-funded study, that we've actually found a lot more male involvement. So what will happen is that the men will hear about this intervention. They'll come along with their wives to the intervention. We think mostly in some ways just to check what's happening, to check that it's all right. And they very quickly become quite engaged. And we've had many men who've actually quietly pushed their wives out of the way, and they've been doing the book sharing because they just love it with their infants. The problem in Lesotho, so there's a real sense of a much greater sense of father involvement, but so many of the men in Lesotho aren't even in Lesotho. They're in South Africa as migrant laborers. So these are the kinds of struggles. And so, and in my experience in a pilot study, for example, of the soccer study, one of the things we picked up unexpectedly, and this is not about parenting, this study, but that many of these men were desperately sad and desperately wanting to have access to their infants or their children, but weren't allowed. and were really struggling with this, and then struggling with their identity as a father and being able to provide if they were unemployed, which had then other implications for their violence as a result of that lack of access. And so it's incredibly complex. So in our experience, when we've managed to get a man in the room to show his infant at 4 days, the person I said that ran out applauding wasn't the mother, it was a father, who almost instantaneously transformed his idea. He I think thought that his baby was the only baby on earth that could hear, and was the smart child, and he wanted everyone to hear. But and I've often said that when fathers aren't involved, there's a tipping point. You can just keep them involved with a little baby. At some point they realize, wow, this is actually quite nice, quite interesting. It's about getting them in the room long enough to get to that tipping point. So we have not been successful is the very short answer for that other long answer I've just given. We haven't been successful in engaging fathers very well.
Okay, we'll take 2 questions at a time. So one question coming up.
Hi, it's Usha Bhatia. My question is about when we talk about parenting, are we also including and considering ways of engaging the family hierarchy, the decision makers who influence the parents? And I'm just curious if you've done that. In other words, the matriarch may be the parent's grand aunt or something other than.
Right. And Usha, where are you working?
Independent.
Okay. And one other question, if I could add in. So with respect to the curriculum and with respect to the work that you're doing under this project in South Africa, have you noticed any change in the in responsive parenting and like the joint attention approaches when it comes to women or parents who have multiple children? Like, have there been any changes? Any difference? Have you noticed any differences between parents who have multiple children versus parents who may have one child and have a baby on the way? If you could talk about that, that would be very helpful to me.
Okay, thank you. In terms of hierarchy and engaging family, we do. So for example, in a totally other separate trial we did in KwaZulu-Natal called the Good Start trial, I think one of the big mistakes that interventions make is that information is enough, and so we provide information. We may even provide it in the context of a caring relationship with a community health worker, and then we assume that that's enough. And so in a previous study, just prior to that study, which was about exclusive and appropriate feeding, we very quickly realized that the women in the community, they knew what they should be doing. They had got it from the information from clinics, and they actually were very well informed. The barrier was that the moment they got home, is that, so for example, if you've decided to exclusively breastfeed, basically your baby is not going to be, if you do that well and you do that, the baby's going to be, we know, as healthy as anything, but they're not going to be nice and chubby. Because breastfed babies don't often put on huge amounts of weight, whereas if you feed them porridge earlier on, they do. So mothers know that, but they also know that as soon as they get home, their mother-in-law says, no, there's something wrong with your baby, they're too thin, and will say you must feed them porridge. And they're not in a position, because of that hierarchy within the family, to say no to that, or they haven't disclosed the HIV status and so can't have that discussion. Again, very complicated. So what we did there, that the first step was what decisions we made. The second, the community health worker would then engage with them is, well, can you do it? Can you exclusively breastfeed? If you've got a husband who won't allow it, or a matriarch, or someone who can't do it, your mother, your mother-in-law, well, in fact, then you actually have to think of another solution. And maybe we go to formula feeding, and then think about the barriers to that in terms of a fridge, boiling capacity, of all the things for the bottle. So very much engaging with that family unit, and it's not just about the caregiver. Having said that, I don't want to make this sound better than it is. One of the issues we have is that we do these early interventions with the caregiver, but in our 13-year follow-up with the Tulasana study, we found that over 25% of those children are no longer living with the biological mother. They're living with grandmothers or aunts. And so you target your intervention at the caregiver, but there's often lots of mobility. And I think that's a real stumbling block. So the other question around the curriculum, it's a very interesting question because it's something I'm very interested in in thinking about to see whether interventions targeted at a particular person in a household has impact, or dyad, for example, has impacts on the other children, for example. And so we haven't done that as yet, but we're thinking. We've just published a paper on a neighborhood-wide impact of child stunting of an intervention targeted at a mother and the single child, part of a Polanyi study that we've published together with a colleague of mine at UCLA, Mary Jane Rotherham-Boris. We have been following also cluster randomized control trial over 6 years now. And we have some neighborhood-wide family effects on other children in the household. But that, I think it's a very good question, and it's not something that's often measured. So you assess the index child and the mother, but you don't then think about the siblings, and you don't think about, well, what are the impacts maybe even with the next child that comes along, the next baby. And I think that's should be a really an area of research. We don't have a lot of it, but we're starting to look at that.
Thank you. Nicole, are there?
There's one.
Great. There are questions. Let's take a few questions from the online participants. It'll just be easier if I read this out loud. So this is from Michaela Hall. She said, "Thank you for the fascinating presentation. My question is regarding prevailing gender norms in countries where there exists a preference for having sons over daughters, or, unfortunately, where there are high levels of female infanticide. In your research surrounding prenatal care and as a result of the early interventions, have there been any successes in, perhaps indirectly, shifting the cultural norms towards valuing baby girls in those communities? Is this topic of son preference addressed in the curriculum?" Good. Yeah, let's take one more question.
Hi, good morning. I'm Melissa Kelly from Child Fund International, and I think there's been a lot of discussion around unpacking caregivers and daycare, these informal caregivers in the community, especially peri-urban and urban settings. And I was just wondering if you knew of any studies that are going on now. I know Aga Khan's doing some work in Nairobi, but are there any studies that are planned or going on to try to look at these, mostly women, I think, that children are spending a lot of time with, but may be informal and not really have any mandate from the government?
Okay. So May, that's the first question. Is I'm not sure I'm the best person to attempt that answer. So in South Africa, we don't have a problem with infanticide, certainly in terms of girls being, that's not something we struggle with. So it hasn't been something we directly address. There is still a preference for boys in many places, but it certainly hasn't resulted in that. And I think this is a huge gap. It's a huge gap that the What Works group, with Rachel Jukes and various people have pinpointed, and I'm fully supportive. It is a gap that it's not something in the work we've done that we directly address these gender norms. And I think it's a very serious limitation. I don't know what has been done in places like India and China where the problem is mostly located. Yeah, I'm not the person to ask about that. But I think that the gender norms within South Africa are they have to be addressed. They're hugely problematic, and it plays itself out in extreme levels of rape, extreme levels of violence, and it is going to have to start very, very early. And whether that's just in terms of, hopefully our early interventions can touch on some of the issues around empathy and early theory of mind, and maybe there's an impact on that, or directly think about trying to include elements such as, for example, again, if we think about responsivity and we think about responsiveness in child monitoring, the extent to which that could be used as a very clever way of thinking with parents about how interpersonal violence within the home that's witnessed by those children might have implications for that child. And in terms of informal care networks, I think, again, a really important question, a really important area of research. Again, not something that we've done. I know that that some people within WHO are trying to think about some research there where they're trying to use, if you think about the number of women globally who are involved in, for example, informal work, selling vegetables on the side of the road, and thinking about, well, where are their babies and their children, and who's being cared for them, and to try to access some of exactly what you're talking. So that's a particular study I know that's in the planning stage, but I think it's essential. You know, and as you were talking, I thought you were going to ask something different, and you know, one of the issues that I think is an increasingly topical issue is that of, for example, in the community health workers or you know, community-based care of various types, is this issue of, for example, volunteers versus paid. You know, and that's another area that we're increasingly trying to think about, and we have some evidence from another study looking at CBOs, and we've shown how when community health workers are actually paid, even a stipend, that the outcomes of children are better than if volunteers are used. And I'm not, volunteers have produced, you know, have obviously been an important resource for many decades, but that's another area that we have to think about.
Great. So we have a couple more minutes, and so a couple more, some time to ask a few more questions. Great.
Hi. Thank you very much. This is Charlotte Feldman Jacobs with Population Reference Bureau. So I'm sure you're aware that when the multi-country study was done a few years ago now, that violence against women, domestic violence during pregnancy, showed up in remarkable levels. Does any of the pre-delivery work that's being done focus on actual domestic violence against the pregnant mother?
So not, I mean, in our work up until now, no, but that's something that we're working with SVRI and others to correct. But I do know, you know, anecdotally from, I think the What Works kind of group, I think has been amazing. I think it's created a whole impetus and an incredible movement where people are thinking about this very differently, and it's coming into, you know, being included in lots of different areas. So anecdotally, I think that is happening, and that's certainly something we're going to do. But, you know, again, I could be speaking out of turn. I may not know of where things are. I know, for example, about the Uganda project that's going to be spoken about afterwards. I think that's the kind of thing that we need to be doing more generally. But I think that you will see in the next, you know, 3 to 5, 6 years, a lot more, you know, data coming out around domestic violence, around including that in whether it's more health interventions or whether it's in parenting interventions.
Anyone else? Oh, one in the back.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Rebecca Gordon with Together for Girls. So building off of the last question, I was also curious about whether recently in some of these harsh parenting and positive parenting, father involvement interventions, there's been attention to reducing violence in early childhood. And I'm wondering if you've seen either anecdotally or quantitatively any impact on that, and whether in these studies where you've been able to do follow-up, you've seen longer-term reductions in use of violence by either parent.
So I'm not sure I got the entire question. Is it in terms of impact on early aggression and violence, and whether we've impacted that? Is that the question? It just faded a bit.
Sorry, whether you've seen impacts on violence both in early childhood or in longer-term follow-up.
Okay, so what we're currently involved in a study comparing two samples, one in Uganda and one in South Africa, where we're looking at exactly that. We don't have the data, so we're trying to explore that. One of the things we will be looking at in the Tulasana study, as we analyze further, one of the things we're going to look at is we did the CBCL strengths and difficulty. We'll be looking at that in the analysis. And also in the Polanyi study, where we've developed an interesting, I suppose, experiment with the 5-year-olds by putting 3 5-year-olds in a room, and we've 3 boys or 3 girls, and we put 3 toys in the room, and one is fantastic, or two is fantastic, and one's boring as anything, and then we film them and watch how they negotiate the use. And with experiments, it's very close because if somebody's getting hit or punched to get it, we have to intervene, obviously. So that we will be able to produce a lot of, I think, some data from that in the near future. One interesting thing around gender, which is not about the violence, but I think it's fascinating, and we need to confirm this. But in this Tulasana study at age 13, we measured the cognitive development of all the children. And there was no impact on cognitive development by intervention groups. So the early intervention in the early infancy that was focused on the relationship, and it wasn't directly cognitive stimulation. So it's maybe we could just say that it's unlikely that there'd be an effect at 13 years on cognitive development. So there's nothing there by group. But what is there, if you take the whole group, the whole control and intervention together, is that on every single subtest and the whole way through, is that boys are doing much better than girls in this context, which is very, very interesting, because usually it's exactly the opposite way around. If there's a difference, even in context of risk, the girls are doing better. And I don't know how to understand that. We haven't explored it entirely. But there's a part of me, my most worried self, my most negative dark side, that thinks that some of these 13-year-old girls have already given up, that they don't see a future in terms of school and what it'll offer them, that it's so patriarchal that they and I hope I'm wrong. I hope there's some other thing that can better explain it. But that's something we're also going to explore in the near future.
Thank you, Professor Tomlinson, and thank you everyone for your very insightful questions. Wow, some very interesting insights on empathy and responsive parenting and the role of fathers, especially when it comes to fathers who actually want to be involved but aren't necessarily able to because of societal norms. I would like to move quickly on to the next speaker. And for an introduction to Kim Ashbourne is Senior Research Officer with the Institute of Reproductive Health at Georgetown University. As a social and behavioral scientist, Dr. Ashbourne's research explores social structural determinants of HIV risk and sexual and reproductive health. Some of her current work focuses on applying a father-centered approach targeting young fathers to reduce intimate partner violence and child maltreatment. Also developing social norm measures for normative interventions to prevent violence and promote sexual and reproductive health, as well as using social network diffusion to promote family planning use. Her research has spanned countries in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Dr. Ashbourne, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks to Doris and Lee for inviting me to come to talk about this really exciting project. And thanks for that great presentation from Dr. Tomlinson. My mind was just racing, lots of really interesting comments and questions and things to explore during this presentation and this session. I wanted to introduce two. I'm with IRH at Georgetown University, and this project is a joint implementation with Save the Children. So my colleague back in the back there, Deb Almond, is here also from Save the Children, who is a technical advisor on the Real Fathers Project. So it's actually REAL is an acronym for Responsible, Loving, and Engaged Fathers, which we call Real Fathers for short, which is kind of neat. It's kind of a very sticky title. So just to give you a quick overview, as I said, the Real Fathers Initiative is jointly implemented by IRH and Save the Children. We had the goal of developing and testing a father-centered approach to reduce violence, both child physical violence against children and intimate partner violence against women. We are conducting this, we conducted this pilot in the northern region of Uganda, which is a post-conflict setting. There was a 20-some-year civil war in that area. So most of these guys who we intervened with, who participated in Real Fathers, have been affected by that conflict at some point in their lives. Our specific objectives really were to look at whether or not this intervention could increase some of the positive parenting practices. We wanted to look at the level of confidence in
being able to parent in a positive way. And also, of course, wanted to look at the violence indicators for children and for child punishment as well as intimate partner violence. This is just a sort of snapshot of what I'll be talking about today and sort of the sequence. So I wanted to describe a little bit about what the Real Fathers Initiative is, a little bit about the implementation, some of our survey and qualitative results from the pilot study, and also implications for and some of the next steps, which we're already doing now in a few new districts in similar regions close to the pilot area. So before we started with the intervention, there was some formative research that was conducted to sort of inform how the intervention should be designed, what kinds of things we should focus on. So there were some focus groups conducted with some young men of the age. The target population for the intervention is 16 to 25-year-old men, very young men. As Dr. Tomlinson was saying, our impression was to start young would be more effective than so when these parenting and relationship behaviors are new and people aren't necessarily have any experience to fall back on, and there's a bit of ambiguity, which the literature says when there's ambiguity, then that means that we can potentially intervene and sort of influence those behaviors. So the young fathers seemed to say, what they did say in the formative research was that they felt that they could benefit greatly from some kind of intervention that's focused on fathers exclusively, that they really loved their children, they wanted to bond more with their children, that they thought of their children as their legacy in life. They are in relatively new relationships. And many of the men talked about the importance of paying the bride price. And in this context, if they haven't fully paid the bride price, it's a bit easier for women to leave the relationship. They can leave the relationship and also take the children with them. The men would have to go then to the elders to negotiate the return of the wife, and this may involve some fines or other things like that if the man had been sort of considered to have done something wrong in terms of the relationship. The young fathers also believed that they were living in a very different time. So historically, men were provided a portion of land for their homes, to build their homes and to start their families, and that isn't necessarily the case these days. They were also guided historically by elders in their communities to teach them how to be parents, how to operate within a marital relationship, and that isn't necessarily occurring anymore either. So these key findings in the formative research, when we asked men what they thought an ideal man was, they related things like he's a provider, he is an authoritarian in his household, he's respected by his family, he's respected by his community and his children. And these things really resonated with our baseline survey when we started doing the evaluation of the initiative, of the pilot, where 86% of the men said that they agreed with the statement that women should obey the husband in all things, and 81% said that the man should have final word about all decisions in the household. So we certainly saw an overlap between the formative and the baseline survey that we did when we were starting out with the pilot. So I just want to talk a little bit about the intervention, but first, this is the theory of change that was developed to help guide the research. We hypothesized that this father-centered kind of intervention through modeling alternative nonviolent strategies, both for child discipline and for conflict resolution with intimate partners, through some parent education and skills building, would improve attitudes that would not be supportive of using violence, either in child in parenting practices or in relationships, that this would increase the confidence that a man had in disciplining his child using nonviolent tactics or strategies, I should say. This would improve couple communication and also parenting practices with the ultimate outcomes of reducing violence and improving agreement with non-traditional gender norms. So the intervention itself, 64 men from the study communities were recruited to be mentors. And these mentors were actually selected by the young fathers themselves. So the project didn't go out and recruit them per se. The young men were asked, what are the qualities of someone that would be a mentor for you? So men were saying things like they're trusted, they're not drinking too much, they give good advice, etc. So the men were able to choose the person from their community that they wanted to work with to be their mentor. Each mentor was assigned 4 or so, or some had 3 young fathers to guide throughout the project. They met with their mentee 12 times during the 6-month project. So they met twice a month. One time was a one-on-one mentoring session. The second time during the month was a group session. So 3 or 4 mentors would come together with their mentees, and they would facilitate a group conversation around the particular theme for that month. 2 of the individual one-on-one sessions were with the wives as well of the mentees, and one of the group sessions also had a couple-based component. So in addition to the mentoring sessions, there was a bit of a sort of community level intervention, and this was in the format of these posters. So there were 6 posters that were changed sequentially. Each month there was a new poster that corresponded with the themes that were being discussed during the mentoring sessions. And these posters had an image, photograph, all the photographs were taken actually locally, so people could really relate to the people in the pictures. And they had some text, and the text all had messages around fatherhood, use of discipline practices, and so forth. So, for example, some of the text says something like, "My son is a real father. He works hard. He cares for his children financially and emotionally. He has a vision for his children's future and works hard to achieve it. He disciplines children without violence to teach his children well." At the end, after all of the mentoring sessions are over, there was one big community celebration, as we were calling it, to invite the men to come to share what they learned, and also to give an opportunity for the community to support the men in moving forward, practicing the new behaviors that they learned, and to support them in those changes. So some of the evidence of the kinds of changes that we're hoping to see from the Real Fathers Initiative came through in lots of testimonials that people provided during these community celebrations. And this is just one from one of a young man's wife. She says, "My husband was really bad news, but because of the mentoring sessions, there's change at home. He bathes children, sometimes we weed together, he collects firewood, and there's total sharing of responsibilities. I'm very happy for this, and my prayer is that he continues like this for the rest of the time." So now I'm going to share a little bit about the evaluation. This was our original research design. It was a randomized controlled design. We recruited 500 men, and we used a lottery system to assign them to a control or intervention group. Then we did a baseline survey. The intervention was implemented. There was a 3-month period post-intervention before we did the end-line survey. And then we came back about 10 or 12 months later. We had 2 different cohorts because we had an initial level of funding, but we were able to get additional funding, which, by the way, I should have said the project was funded mostly by USAID. And because I see they're here. and we came back and did a 3rd round, which was the longer term follow-up, which is actually pretty interesting, and you'll see how. But one caveat to this, and this probably happens a lot, and in full transparency, we weren't able to track the group assignments for of the control and intervention arms. We tried to do this at the individual level. So within one community, there could potentially be over 1 men assigned to both control and intervention groups. So it's kind of hard to do this, as we discovered. So the evaluation results I'm showing you today are based on men who were exposed to the intervention and men who were not exposed to the intervention. We did do a sensitivity analysis. We tried to do like get as close as we could to intention to treat kind of analysis, and we did not find very different results. So, so that's good. That's the good part. So these are the main sort of buckets or kind of thematic topics of the outcomes that we were looking at. They're around parenting, the intimate relationships and the marital relationship, and gender norms. At baseline, most of these men were young, and the wives were a little bit younger on average than their male partners. A little more than half attended primary school. About 90-something% were involved in farming. Only about 10% or less, a little less than 10% had paid work. So many said that sometimes they had witnessed violence in their own home as a child. 57% said sometimes, 22% said they often saw this. 54% said that they were sometimes actually experienced violence themselves as a child. And we know from there's a lot of evidence out there that says that this is a cyclical thing. So exposure to violence during childhood could lead to perpetration or experience of violence later in life. Most were with their partner for in the early stages, we'll say, of a relationship, 1 to 3 years, and slightly more than half of them had already paid, partially paid for bride price. So first I'm going to show you some parenting outcomes. So this is a series of multivariate logistic regression models. We did adjust each model for some background characteristics like employment status of the man, the payment of the bride price, couple communication, and alcohol use. Also, we controlled for history of violence too, violence of the child. So you can see that those men, and the way that we're measuring exposure is a man who attended at least one individual mentoring session and at least one group mentoring session. And you can see there were some positive results in terms of rejecting use of physical punishment for children. We see that those men who were participating in the program were significantly more likely to have an attitude that is not supportive of physical punishment for children. And then men, we saw a huge increase in odds of men who said that they are very confident in using nonviolent discipline with their children. The men who participated in the program were more likely to spend more time with their children versus men who did not participate in the program, almost 3 times the odds, interestingly, at long-term follow-up. And then at the bottom, you can see use of physical punishment. We also saw a decline. Interestingly, we didn't see those declines right away significantly, but over long term, we saw a very significant reduction in the use of physical violence against children. Oh, actually, I wanted to go back to this for a second. We also looked at whether or not it was important if the child was a girl or a boy. And we didn't really see, it didn't seem to be a significant factor in these, for these different parenting behaviors. Just wanted to add that. And now we're looking at intimate partner relationships and gender norms. So our gender norm measures were mostly around the role of the woman in the household, but we did have some specific things about the role of men. I just took a sample of some of these to show you today. So these also were multivariate regression models. So we looked at whether or not they agreed with each one of these statements. So you can see at long-term follow-up, at endline, nothing really happened. So nothing was significant about this. People tended not to agree with these statements, but it wasn't any kind of significant difference between participating in the program and not. Although at long-term follow-up, we do see that there was a significant decline in agreement with these statements, which I found fascinating. I thought, I wonder why this is happening. But I know maybe gender norm change takes a long time to establish itself, so that may have something to do with it. I don't know.
When you say long term, how much longer?
Yeah. So we had 2 cohorts, and the long-term follow-up for the first cohort was a year after the end line. So this was, for the second cohort, it was 8 months after, I think that, yeah, 8 months after the end line. So it was quite a long time after the intervention had actually taken place. So now we're on intimate partner relationships. So again, these are multivariate logistic regression models controlling for the same factors I had mentioned before, the same background characteristics. So couple communication, we saw big increases in the odds of communicating as a couple. And we had 4 items. It was an index that we added together, these 4 items, and they had to have all 4 items. So you listened to your partner, you talked about things that frustrated you with your partner, you talked about things that made you happy, etc. We see that also there was a huge decline in the odds of agreeing with any reason justifying a husband beating his wife. We use the standard measure that you see in the DHS to measure that, particularly at long term, over the longer term. And perpetrating any form of violence, we did see an immediate effect right after at end-line, but also, again, sustained over long term, significant reduction. And then when we measured violence, we measured 3 different types of violence. And I just wanted to sort of, show each kind of form of violence because I think it's really interesting how this sort of played out. So for physical violence, it's not that it didn't go down because it went down dramatically. We saw like from 40% at baseline dropping down to like 16% for the control group. Similarly for the intervention group from about 40% to like 9% or something like that. But we saw declines in both the exposed people and the non-exposed people. So I think there was just some, spillover, if you will, to the people that didn't participate in the program. So it doesn't look significant, but there was a big decrease. The psychological violence, and this kind of makes sense to me because they were in these mentoring sessions and they were talking about communication and they were talking about issues related to how to negotiate with your partner, how do you de-escalate arguments or things that could become violent. And so we see reductions in both psychological and verbal violence at end-line both and sustained over time. Just another quote from another one of our community celebrations. And this one's particularly poignant because this person makes a comment about a post-conflict setting. And this is a young dad, and he says, "I feel changed. I understand that at home we should talk over certain issues that could cause serious quarrels. To be good examples to our children and use positive ways to communicate to make a happy home. This is indeed," he says, "a post-war time." So our next steps, well, our conclusions rather, first, we conclude that this is like a very promising intervention. And interestingly, that we're affecting both forms of violence, intimate partner violence as well as child mistreatment. That it's a relatively short intervention, also based on volunteerism of the community mentors. I also understand, interestingly, that gender norms take some time to change, but it's possible to change them. Right now, we're doing scale up in 3 new districts in northern region. We went back to a Lulu district, the original district where we did the pilot because we needed to up our numbers for the scale up. And we're also working in Karamoja and a district in Karamoja region. We just want to see if we'll get the same results that we got from our pilot. And we added a family planning session to the curriculum to see how that works. And we beefed up a little bit of the training to get for the mentors to understand a bit more about the referral system there is locally for gender-based violence as well as for child protection services. And one thing that we learned through the pilot was the father said, we're learning a lot. This is really important. We're learning a lot how to be in a relationship. We're learning a lot about how to discipline our children. But we really are interested in economic opportunities. So part of the pilot is, part of the scale up is to try to integrate the Real Fathers curriculum into some ongoing economic strengthening programs as well as early childhood education programming. And so we're going to see how this works out. But we think it's pretty promising, and we see it as a very flexible program that could potentially be integrated into all kinds of other programs, whether it's economic strengthening or maternal and child health or HIV. And that's it. We have more information on our website. If you're interested in reading more, all of our materials are up there, the materials that were developed for the treatment mentors and the curriculum.
Thank you. There we go. Thank you, Dr. Ashley. Is it possible to put Professor Tomlinson back on in case he has questions? We could see him talking. Or should we keep where is this still on? Is he still on? Professor Tomlinson? No. Nope. Oh, okay. Okay, so lots of questions. Great. So we'll start here, and we'll take, what time is it? Yeah. So we'll take like 3 questions at a time. Is that okay? All right. So 1, 2, and then 3.
My name is Taru Faramand. I'm with YHAD, and we focus on gender integration in health education, rule of law, and now in the energy sector. Thank you so much for these results. We are now implementing a project to address gender-based violence under the DREAMS initiative in the same district. I think you implemented this in Lira because I researched what you have. No, it's not Lira? Okay. Okay. So, but you will be in Gulu and we will be working in Gulu. I would very much like to build on what you have accomplished and maybe make some linkages. What would you recommend that we do to basically access what you're doing and make that linkage? Because the DREAMS project or initiative that we're working on also addresses income generation activities through the best outcomes or better outcomes project. So there's a lot of opportunities to link those programs together to have a better outcome. And not a question, but a comment. I love the baby career that the father was holding. I wonder who made it, because this can be a income generation for women. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Kim. That was great. My name is Doris Bartel. I'm here. I have a question for you about dropout for the fathers. How many of them dropped out? And I'm just so curious about the differences in results for the long-term follow-up and the kind of the shorter-term inline follow-up. I'm just wondering if you have any reflections on that. Not that there's possible to disaggregate the data that way, but is it possible that you think norms are actually influencing things more than actual time with the curiosity? Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Hi, Melissa Kelly Chadfine. I was just wondering about, again, this longer term follow-up. Are you able to distinguish between the fathers who still have a relationship with the mentors? Because it seems like that was a really strong component of the project.
So I'll just address those 3 maybe. I don't know who made the baby carrier, but it's pretty cute. It looks really nice. I know about the DREAMS initiative. So the pilot was done in Amuru district, which is where all these results come from. And then we're scaling up in part of Amuru that was not part of the pilot. And we are in Noida district now and Gulu district. So we definitely have crossover with where the DREAMS initiative is starting to implement activities. So I don't know exactly what you're doing, but I think, if you wanted to just kind of go to the website and look at the mentor curriculum and see kind of the content of it and how it's structured, maybe I'm happy to talk to you, at any point about what you think might be a nice integration of that or how we could maybe work together. It's a very structured curriculum, so I feel like that's part of the thing that makes it such an interesting and easy to use intervention is that it's 6 months and they have
training in the beginning, and then there's another refresher training after they do like the third session or something. So and we're now adapting it, and Deb can attest to a very low literate population in Karamoja. So we're using a lot more pictures, we've kind of slowed it down a notch. There's more focus on the group discussions rather than the one-on-one with the mentor and the mentee, so that we can pair up a higher literacy level mentor with a lower literacy level mentor to kind of give them a little more support and guidance. And we organized, I don't know, well, anyway, we'll probably get to that, but let me address the other question about the dropout. We did have dropout, and our biggest problem with the dropout was following up men who moved out of the area for jobs, basically, for income generation. So especially in the study sites that were, so Amuru district, I don't know if you remember from the map, but the very northern part of Uganda borders South Sudan, and there's a lot of activity along that border. There's a lot of construction in southern Sudan. There's a lot of guys with taxi, motorcycle taxis. So there was a lot of mobility, and we lost men in terms of attendance. Sometimes they couldn't kind of make it to each, they would schedule a time to meet with their mentor, but then they wouldn't be home when the mentor visited, and that kind of thing we did have. I think the dropout was about 30% or something. I actually don't have that off the top of my head, but that was the primary reason, the mobility. So in terms of the group discussions, we tried to, it was a little easier to get men to come to those because they could come together, they could bring their friend. So they were encouraged by the community leadership to attend their mentoring sessions as much as they could. So those are some of the ways that we try to work around that. I think the norm change stuff is so fascinating. I can look at who continued to meet with their mentor. We did ask that question in the long-term follow-up. I just don't have the results here. So, but it is possible to see, as the sessions went on, obviously more and more men dropped out. So we had a majority of them coming to at least one of the individual, one of the group sessions, but then, it gets the numbers get a little smaller, so it's a little bit more tricky to actually know what's going on. But I mean, I sort of think it does take a long time to practice the skills and to practice especially the relational things. So with the wife, and I could see that taking some time to take root. And when we did the qualitative interviews, there was a lot of back and forth. So the wives would say, well, at first we were both pretty skeptical about this, but then we could see the benefits, and it was really interesting, and we kept on going. And then they would kind of like be influenced a lot by conversation around them. So that question about who else can you engage in the parenting programs is actually really important. And so we've tried to expand that a little bit in the scale up so that young men are going and talking with their wife to people around them who are significant, who are influential people, whether that's their friends or their mother-in-law or whoever, to explain the project and to say, this is what we're going to be doing for the next 6 months. We'd really like for you to support us in this, etc. So we didn't do that so much in the pilot. I think men were often struggling with a lot of, criticism, and maybe it was jealousy even because the slightly older men who also had toddler-age children were too old for the program. And so maybe they really would have benefited, they could see the benefits, and they would want to have participated themselves. So that's a question I don't know if it's really the case. But anyway, I find it interesting too. But we did ask, so we can kind of follow up. I think some of the mentors lived very close to the mentees, and some lived maybe like 4 kilometers, I think was about the furthest away. But these communities, that's pretty far if you have to walk. Yeah.
Additional questions? So 1, 2, and then you call.
Thanks, Kim. Quick question just around engagement of the government. And if you can talk a little bit about that, because I think in terms of sustainability, you know, when USAID funds or other donor funds end, it's always a question of who is it that will be carrying these initiatives on. And it sounds like some great outcomes here, and certainly want to make sure that those outcomes and, you know, these children of these fathers, you know, continue to be able to add that first. Oh, I'm talking Elizabeth Berard from USAID in the Office of IGWG.
Hi, Sung Lee from Save the Children. Thanks for presenting on behalf of Save. And it's great to see. I mean, I'm going to ask a question. I could probably go and ask Brad, but I'm going to take this advantage of being here. It's great, and the long-term impact is I'm really interested. I just came back from Uganda, where corporal punishment in schools is still a huge issue. Something that I'm experiencing violence regularly. I'm kind of curious, when we did the formative research, how much of the violence they saw was actually in school setting. And if we could get a longer-term impact and see what these parents, how much more will they get engaged? Since when you say long-term, like I'm thinking of like 5 years when the children now going to school. Will they get more involved and could the government of Uganda and society get better at actually reducing corporal punishment?
Hi, Nicole Abney with USAID in the Office of Population Productive Health and the IGWG. Thanks for this great presentation. I wanted to build on something that you just touched on a little bit, and that is sort of the role of the wives. If I understand correctly, there are only 2 sessions that are formally with the couple. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about why those were developed in the first place, and what you think is the value added of those sessions and whether you think it's enough, and also just what's the content. And I assume it was those sessions are done also with the same male mentor, and how you think that works and whether you would choose that model.
Thanks for those questions. So government engagement is really important. Sustainability is one of the things we're trying to focus on with the scale up. So we've done a lot more dissemination, I feel like, in DC than we had in Uganda. So we're trying to work on that. We did recently go to a Ministry of Gender-sponsored meeting on parenting in Uganda, and we presented these results, which was very well received. People are very interested in this. And so we're trying to figure out now how to work our way into the more official planning that goes on at the district level in particular, and how can we potentially have some funds obligated toward these kinds of programs. We did for the pilot, and we do also for the scale up experience, a technical advisory group. And that group is really key, I think, and will be really key in figuring out how to sustain the intervention or using these kinds of interventions in parenting programming in Uganda. So they have their own constituents and networks, and we're hoping that they can contribute their intimate knowledge of those and what's going on in Uganda to be able to help us figure out how to do the sustainability both locally at the district level, and then we have some national level folks too that are on the technical advisory board. So we have local level government participation. So in the scale up, during the pilot, the community development officers in some of the areas were involved in the mentor training. Some of them, we had some local council members at the first level, which is the village level, were mentors, some of them. So we did have a fair amount of engagement with the local leadership in the communities, and also in the scale up. Our model is to train, it's sort of a training of the trainers, sort of cascade training model, where we're training up local leadership to take over the role of overseeing training and overseeing the mentors. So we're seeing how that works. Are they able to do it? Is it something that they can feasibly take on and manage themselves? And so far, so good.
we're doing it. We're like to the third session or something in Gulu, but we're getting there. Yeah, we're very interested in sustainability and trying to figure out how to be able to do that. The violence in the school setting is huge. Even our implementer who was working on the ground thought that, yeah, it's really important for parents to spank their children. You can't get away from that. That's just what you have to do as a good parent. So, someone who is clearly dedicated to reducing violence still has that framework. So it's a really, really hard tide to turn. But, and I don't know about how much violence was in the school setting. Our formative research was just with the parents. And some of them have older children, but to be in the program had to have toddler age kids between the ages of 1 and 3, so they weren't in school yet. So from our own data, we didn't really have information about school-based school setting violence. I think with something like this, it's a great tool to use to educate about, like what Dr. Tomlinson was saying about renegotiating your interaction between the parent and the child, and figuring out how to do that in a different way. The role of the wives, the wives were so interested in the intervention, and they were so eager about it. They would prepare their husbands for the session before they knew what time they were going. They knew when the mentor was coming for a visit. So they would kind of be watching from afar, trying to listen to what the conversation was and things like that. I mean, they reported all these things, and we did some qualitative interviews. We didn't survey the wives because we were very sensitive about contributing to any kind of violence that was existing already. So we did do some in-depth interviews with a few wives, which were very interesting and informative. And there was, after the initial couple of sessions, during the pilot, there was a group discussion with the wives to find out how would you like to participate more in the program, and how can wives support their husbands in practicing their new skills and attending, adhering to their mentoring schedule and things like this. So they learned a little bit. The wives were ready to go. They wanted their sessions along with the husband, but we just couldn't do it at the time during the pilot. And I think it is important. We didn't actually see a huge added value of engaging with the wives, actually, interestingly, statistically speaking. So it just looked like the men who participated in the program also had a wife who was engaging with the mentors. So we didn't really have many men who didn't have a wife who was participating. So we couldn't really look at that question, actually, very carefully.
Just a clarifying question, and I may have missed this. So how was the reduction in behavior, in psychological and physical violence? Was it all self-reported? By whom? Yeah. And could it be cross-checked with hospital and police reports, for instance?
I think the gender-based violence data is captured at the very local level. So the LT1, I think, is the person that keeps all of the records about someone who a case of violence happens in a community, and that person is keeping a record of those cases. It's all self-reported data, as is all survey data. So I just want to say that because I think maybe people experiment with different ways of administering these surveys to see if they get more sincere responses, and I think all that's very tricky. In this context, I know people have used like computer-aided surveys and things like that, and I don't know in this particular context. It actually, I've been in situations where people talk very openly, the good couples talk very openly about the violence that exists in their partnership. And for us, coming from the United States, I'm always like, yeah, yikes, do you really want to say that in front of your partner who is beating you or doing these things, whatever? But they're not, it's just a different approach to dealing with it, and that it's such a part of life, I think, for a lot of people that there isn't that same dynamic of like, I can't talk about this in front of him because there'll be some retribution against me. And the partners on the ground very much said all the time, why can't we just survey the wives? And they just didn't see that as a problem at all. And anyway, so I definitely, and Deb, did you want to add something? I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that. I just want to say there's a real strong hierarchy between how you report violence. So although it might get to the LC1, that member of the community, a more official position, at some point later down the line, first of all, it would have to go to the elders in the community and to other members of the family. So verifying what kinds of violence took place would be a lot more complicated than getting records from a certain office at where the LC1 works, or hospital records, because people just don't access healthcare in that kind of way.
Start back here with one, and then here over in the corner.
Thank you so much for an excellent presentation. My name is Dora Banerjee from Chicago. I'm the face of the Child Program. And actually, that kind of gave me a segue to my question. I was wondering if when somebody reports violence, either perpetrating or experiencing it, do you have any formal emergency care in place for GP services? And I was also curious, you mentioned that you integrated a session on family planning, and I wonder if you thought at all about engaging antenatal care to bring involvement in care on. Thank you.
We're going to continue to take questions. I'm going to get Amy, and then I'll come over.
Thanks, Kim. Curious, Amy Chellan, USAID Office of Population and Reproductive Health. Curious as to whether you thought about Real Fathers 2.0 and whether or not you would be working with fathers who have a little bit older children, because you answered one of my questions earlier that a criteria was that they needed to have toddler-age children. So that if you could incorporate parenting skills of how to communicate with young adolescent boys and girls, and the boys therein not long after, quite often, becoming fathers.
Thanks, Kim. Sarah Danish with Bridge Associates International. I think my question relates to what my colleagues just brought up around referral networks. You mentioned, unless I'm mistaken, that you plan to do some emphasis on referral systems and subsequent interventions. Could you talk a little bit about what that might look like and some of the dynamics you're seeing in these locations on referral services with respect to the community, et cetera? You're describing those dynamics and what kind of services might be available.
Okay, great. Thanks for the questions. The links to the GBB services, maybe I'll just answer that one first since you had similar questions. So we know in the pilot we didn't really focus on this very much, and the mentors really are seen as sort of like these people that have some special information about marriage and relationships and dealing with conflict in the couple. And a lot of the men who participated in the pilot mentioned how people would come to them for advice. There were people, some of the young guys were asked to go to mediate conflict for other families, which is something that usually a much older person would be asked to do. So they were feeling very, kind of like, wow, we really have learned a lot, and our social status in this community has really ratcheted up because we've been through this program. So the Uganda is making a serious effort to strengthen their referral system down to the district level. And so we've tried to tap into that a little bit more for the scale-ups. One idea that we have is to not only to educate the mentors a little bit more about what is that referral system for gender-based violence, who do you go to for any particular, if this, if a woman was beaten, for example, or a child, where do you go to report something like that? How do you intervene appropriately? It's, of course, a very sensitive topic. It's very private. It's not necessarily, while people in the community know that it's happening, it's a little bit stigmatized. So we have to be really careful about how we intervene with the mentors and what kind of information we're giving them about what their role is and how to respond to a situation of violence.
And during the whole pilot, we actually only had one time when there was an actual case of physical violence, and the woman went to the mentor for assistance. And I think the police were called, and it was an ongoing with the current situation. So the neighbors were involved as well, I think, as well as the mentor. And so the person was taken to the police station in that case. That was the only one that happened in the 2 years of the pilot program. But that certainly is an important thing to happen and for us to understand how to manage that from that experience. We're also talking about having community health workers come in to link up better both for family planning services, but as well as the child protection services and the GBV services to come to some of the mentoring sessions to talk about what those services are, so that people at least know where to access information, the mentees as well as the mentors. I'm hoping I'm answering that. Do you want to add anything to that, Deb? Not to put you on the spot.
So I got some reports of people, if the guy's not around, paying a guy to go with them and pose as the father. And he goes back to Professor Mark's point earlier about how complicated the relationship is between a man's intention to be a father and be there and being physically able to. They can't pay the right price, they just can't a lot of factors.
And then there was a question about engaging men in prenatal care and family planning. That's such a great question, and we actually asked in the baseline survey about men if they attended the birth of the child, of the index child for the program, and I'm really curious to hear what they say and why, and if they didn't, what were the reasons, what was the main reason why they weren't able to do that. So we don't touch on it necessarily specifically in the curriculum, but I think we do talk a lot about the role of the father when it comes to childcare and just sort of domestic chores around the house, shared labor basically. So we focus a lot more on those kinds of more concrete kind of behaviors that may be indicators of a shift in gender norms in the household at the household level. It's very much covered in the curriculum. I think we just didn't measure it very particular, like so specifically during the pilot intervention. So I don't think we really talked that much about antenatal care, but this is what makes this curriculum so flexible. Because if you wanted to talk about antenatal care, it would be very easy to put those topics into the curriculum. And in terms of the older kids, like a real father's 2.0, definitely. A lot of these dads do have other kids, and some of them have other kids from other, but the older ones had kids from other partners and things like that, or the wife did. So we didn't ask about that in the pilot, if they had other children, but we did ask about it in the scale-up. So I am very curious to know how this works for different family sizes and, different kids of different ages, if they have other children and so forth. So we're curious about it and we're interested in it. We were thinking we might expand the age group and recruit dads of different age children, but the problem is that the curriculum is really specific to the toddler age group. So we didn't want to, we would have had to, at that point, redesign the curriculum a little bit. So we did not do that, but it's certainly a thought.
Thank you, Kim. And I wish Professor Tomlinson had still been on so that we could ask him that question as well about the work that he's done. So it's 11 o'clock now, so unfortunately we'll have to wrap up. If you have questions for him, feel free. I think you might be staying a bit, maybe after and pose your questions to her. Or if not, feel free to send them to, okay. Send them to Nicole, and she'll be able to field them to the appropriate speaker. So just in wrap up, we hope that this discussion and the programs and the data that have been presented here today will be useful to all of you as you move forward in your different areas of work in GBV and youth reproductive health. We were really excited to have this opportunity to delve deeper into how gender norms impact on parenting, and as well as how men can be supported to be the best fathers that they can be by challenging inequitable gender norms and by engaging in and advancing gender equitable masculinities. We'd like to give a very special thanks to our presenters for taking time out of their busy schedules to share their work with us. Thank you very much. We'd also like to thank all of you online as well as physically here in the room for your very engaged and spirited questions. And last but not least, I'd like to thank my colleagues on the IGWG GBV task force for their work on this series, as well as those at PRB and at USAID who have contributed to making this event a reality. And that's Nicole, Avni, Charlotte, Doris, Nicole, and Lee, and sorry Lee, and what was, I forgot his name. Caleb, yes, for providing support for IT. And finally, we'd like to encourage you to please join us for part 4 of the GBV and Youth series. This event will focus on school-based interventions to address GBV and will be held in the coming fall. Information for this will be forthcoming, so please stay tuned. And finally, there is a sign-in sheet at the back of the room. We really need to get an idea of how many people have been here today because we have things we want to send you that are important. And we're really happy that so many of you could join. So please sign in on your way out. Thanks again and have a great rest of your day and week. Thank you.